everybody, welcome back to another video. Now before we begin, I'd like to address a few questions I've been getting about channel memberships. And the first thing is that iPhones and iPads on the default YouTube app do not show the join button. That's the first thing, so you have to do it through a browser. And the next thing is that some countries in Eastern Europe actually do not show the join button either. I don't know how this can be avoided, maybe with a VPN or something. And for those who are already members, if you'd like to get your role to show in the Discord server, you need to synchronize or connect your YouTube channel to your Discord channel. So you'd go to user settings, connections, and then connect your YouTube channel, which you subscribed with, and then you should automatically be put into the tier and automatically be put into the members chat area. Now, in any case, let's get down to it. Now, as we all know, there is a very critical cross-modal integration in the dorsal cochlear nucleus, or the DCN, which is viewed as an auditory relay station which receives significant somatosensory input from structures like the trigeminal nerves, the cervical nerves, or the spinal trigeminal nucleus, or SP5, as we all know. Now, as I've mentioned in my previous videos, altered auditory input, like from peripheral damage, excitotoxicity, can induce either homeostatic or maladaptive plasticity. It also can shift the normal balance of excitation and inhibition in the dorsal cochlear nucleus and other related auditory structures. Neurons begin to exhibit elevated spontaneous firing rates and increased synchrony. And basically this maladaptive patterning emerges as the system attempts to, compensate for the reduced peripheral drive, potentially, and enhancing gain and inadvertently amplifying intrinsic background activity. Now, this does not mean that the brain fills in the gaps of the hearing loss. It's not the same thing. This is just a top-down view of the reinforcement of neural synchrony rather than the bottoms-up view of the DCN. So, of course, feedback loops are not a one-directional street, obviously, but I will be making a video on this more in depth in the future. And hearing loss any degree of hearing loss actually does have a pretty significant role to play in the cacophony of factors that eventually lead to tinnitus, but more on that later. But generally, to put it very simply, the fusiform cells or the cartwheel cells or any cells, I guess you could say, in the auditory pathway are damaged from excitotoxicity. And I guess you could say that the dendrites or the axon terminals of the pre- and postsynaptic neurons start trying to latch on to any neuron that is nearby, basically, after one of them is damaged or dies from excitotoxicity, for example. And this can potentially lead to an increased amount of synchrony in the auditory pathway. This is what those tinnitus charlatans on the internet call neuroplasticity. And what they fail to mention is that neuroplasticity can either be good or bad, so homeostatic plasticity or maladaptive plasticity. A person who doesn't get tinnitus would have successful homeostatic plasticity, when a person who does would have maladaptive plasticity or maladaptive neural synchrony, which is then reinforced, of course, by somatosensory cofactors, inflammation, everything we discussed in previous videos, and also apparently reinforced by top-down noise gain control in the thalamus or the medial geniculate body. For those of you who don't know, the thalamus or the medial geniculate body is very important in auditory processing, and the thalamus is primarily responsible for relaying and processing sensory signals to the auditory cortex. It also receives feedback from the auditory cortex, and this feedback can modulate thalamic activity, serving as a top-down control mechanism. Now, the corticothalamic connections enable the cortex to influence which sensory inputs are highlighted or suppressed, which obviously contributes to gain control and filtering of auditory signals. Now, if any of you guys remember the Susan Shores diagram from the webinar that she had, you can obviously see that there is a direct output from the dorsal cochlear nucleus to the medial geniculate body and to the inferior colliculus. So overall, basically, what does this mean? Feedback loops, predominantly, for example, in tinnitus or hyperacusis, or basically anything. Self-reinforcing feedback loops are not only regulated from the bottom up, for example, from the dorsal cochlear nucleus and higher up the auditory pathway, but they are also regulated from the top down in the example that I gave. So this just, for those of you who don't know, this is just another reason or another thing that just complicates these conditions even further. So something like hearing loss or reduced activity in the auditory nerve fibers can, for example, cause the gain control in the, or the thalamocortical gain control to kind of go bonkers as well. So again, this is not a specific cause. This is just something that is a part of the tinnitus soup, so to speak. And the degree of hearing loss doesn't matter as well. Like, it doesn't mean that like a person has more hearing loss and it means they have worse tinnitus. No. I think all of you understand that it depends solely on all of the factors that I mentioned in my previous videos, like my previous video on middle ear health, my previous video on, for example, somatosensory involvement, and also stress levels. Like, all of this stuff all together can cause these disruptions, for example, and lead to your heightened neural synchrony, and eventually these self-reinforcing feedback loops. Now, after the science, I had a little bit of an experiment that I was planning on doing for quite some time. Now, I do not actually recommend anybody to purposefully try and induce this experiment. I actually strongly recommend against it because everybody is different. And in my case, I have very strong somatosensory synchronization or somatosensory involvement, as pretty much any sort of somatosensory modulation can modify my tinnitus a lot. So, for example, if I press on the location of the trigeminal ganglion, for example, this will cause my tinnitus to be suppressed like 90%, for example. If I press behind my ears, which is, for example, the lesser occipital nerve or greater auricular nerve, depends on the person, it causes my tinnitus to spike. Or if I press on some other nerves or sensory nerves that are located just around my head, like on my forehead, the back of my head, if I bend my neck, anything like that, I am extremely somatic. So keep this in mind. Now, what the experiment actually was. So there's one study that I'm not going to go in depth on, but if anybody is interested in reading it, it's called Enriched Acoustic Environment After Noise Trauma Reduces Hearing Loss and Prevents Cortical Map Reorganization. I'm going to send this in the description as well if anybody is interested in checking this out. But long story short, basically, in the study, they tricked, the auditory pathway or certain patches of increased spontaneous firing rate neurons in the dorsal cochlear nucleus by kind of disguising them by covering them with sound, so to speak. I actually don't recommend anybody do this at home because obviously introducing uncontrolled sound post-acoustic trauma can potentially lead to even more hypersynchronization depending on your condition. So this experiment was done in very, very strictly controlled environments. The thought that I had was, for example, what if I tried to trick? So the thought that I had was, what if I tried to trick the Bayesian brain, so to speak, from drawing the wrong conclusions by introducing a cascade of somatosensory information into the dorsal cochlear nucleus. So recently, literally yesterday, I spiked pretty significantly from dropping a glass bottle onto some metal, and it was extremely loud. I think it was like 120 decibels, maybe more. And it was in a closed area as well, so that kind of, aided to the severity of this acoustic trauma. And as soon as I started feeling my tinnitus starting to increase a little bit, I went and I asked my girlfriend, who is she has experience in physical therapy, to start massaging the hell out of all of my cranial nerves and of all of my cervical nerves as well. So I laid down in bed, and my girlfriend started massaging like my V2 branch, my V3 branch, my V1, like all around my head, like, my neck and stuff like that. And she was massaging it for about maybe 20 to 30 minutes. And while she was doing that, I actually noticed that my left ear decreased, or the tinnitus decreased in my left ear to near silence. And the tinnitus spike itself actually started subsiding a little bit. Now, this is actually pretty huge, because when I get a tinnitus spike, I never, ever improve. Like, I've never improved before. My tinnitus spikes are always permanent. And before anybody asks, I'm absolutely 100% sure that this was not placebo. And even right now, after doing this, after that 30 minutes of cranial nerve and cervical nerve massages that I had post-spike, right now, I would say that my spike is about 10% of what it was, basically. So I still spiked a little bit, but I think I saved myself a lot from a much more significant spike by doing this. And before anybody asks, my left ear did eventually creep back up onto what it was before, but I was able to habituate pretty easily to this new level, because it was so much less worse than it could have been. Now, obviously, this does show the significance of somatosensory involvement, but since I am only one person, and this is just one case, and also I am extremely somatic, before any confirmations or conclusions are drawn, this needs to be done like much more often, this experiment. So if anybody spikes, and if you are somatic, definitely do. You can massage yourself, actually, your neck and your face and your cranial nerves and your cervical nerves. I'm going to link some videos in the descriptions of some massages that you can do. And I'd like anybody who does spike to try this out and see if it actually does something for you, especially if you are somatic, for example. But don't force yourself to spike on purpose, obviously. I'm going to link some videos from this guy called HM Massage in the description and in the comment section, and these are some cranial nerve and cervical massages that you can do yourself, and you can try and see if this is going to help post-spike at all, to try and, I guess, reset the synchrony, so to speak.